Hey everyone, Jason here. Today, we're stepping into one of the most chilling mysteries of our time. December 24th, 2002, Laci Peterson vanishes, and what follows is a media frenzy that paints a husband as a monster. Did Scott Peterson really commit the unthinkable, or was he the victim of a trial by media? Today, we're diving deep into the evidence, the lies, and the truths that left a nation divided. Scott Peterson was born on October 24, 1972, in San Diego, California, to his parents, Jackie and Lee. Now, Jackie, Scott's mother, had faced her share of hardships early in life. When Jackie was just 2 years old, her father was tragically murdered right before Christmas. This early trauma left a lasting impact on her, shaping the person she would become and inevitably influencing the environment in which Scott was raised. Following this tragedy, Jackie's mother suffered a mental breakdown, a response that, given the circumstances, is all too understandable. With a young baby to care for and the devastating loss of her husband weighing heavily on her, she found herself unable to continue raising her daughter. As a result, Jackie was placed in an orphanage known as Nazareth House, where she remained until she reached high school. After her time at the orphanage, Jackie returned home to care for her mother while attending Catholic school. However, her challenges didn't end there. At just 19 years old, she became pregnant and made the difficult decision to give her son up for adoption. Jackie faced a similar situation with another child, whom she also chose to place for adoption. Then, in 1966, she gave birth to her son, John. When John was 4 years old, Jackie met Scott's father, Lee, while attending community college. Together, Jackie and Lee had 5 children before they eventually got married a year later, and then came Scott. Lee, Scott's father, started a crating company that quickly turned into a successful family business. Meanwhile, Jackie owned a boutique, and the family was doing quite well. They were financially comfortable. Growing up, Scott's family mentioned that he had a fondness for hunting. Scott also had a passion for golf and fishing. However, not much is documented about his upbringing. When Scott graduated from high school, he earned a golfing scholarship to Arizona State University, a clear sign of his talent on the course. But college life got the better of him. His focus shifted from golf to partying, drinking, and chasing after girls, which ultimately led to him being kicked off the golf team. Scott was getting a bit too carried away with the college lifestyle, which resulted in his removal from the golf team. Afterward, he transferred to another college and eventually landed at Cal Poly State University. It was here at Cal Poly that Scott seemed to turn a corner. He began taking his studies more seriously and transformed into a model student. Around this time, Scott made the decision to mature, taking on more responsibility by paying for things on his own rather than depending on his parents. Meanwhile, Laci was born on May 4, 1974, to Sharon and Dennis, who already had an older son named Brent. However, about a year after Laci's birth, Sharon and Dennis divorced. A year later, Sharon remarried a man named Ron. It might feel like a lot of names, but I can't help make it clear and easy to follow. Laci lived with her mom, her stepfather Ron, and her brother Brent, and they were a close-knit family. Even as Laci grew into her teenage years, she remained close to them, which isn't always common at that age. On weekends, Laci and Brent would spend time with their dad on his farm. It was during these weekends on the farm that Laci developed a passion for gardening. Growing up in a middle-class family, she enjoyed an all-American lifestyle. She loved cheerleading and frequently had friends over. Laci attended Cal Poly starting in August 1993, where she quickly distinguished herself by earning an Outstanding Freshman Award. In December 1994, Laci met Scott while visiting a friend who worked at the Pacific Cafe, where Scott was also employed at the time. Scott took an interest in Laci, and their connection was instant. Laci gave him her phone number, and they began dating. Laci was thrilled about her new relationship with Scott. Laci was so taken with Scott that she called her mom to share her excitement, saying she thought he might be the one. Eager for her mom to meet him, Laci invited Sharon to the Pacific Cafe for dinner. Scott greeted them at the door, And to make the evening special, he had reserved a table with a dozen red roses for Laci and a dozen white roses for Sharon. It was a heartfelt gesture, reflecting Scott's desire to make a good impression. Scott was definitely scoring some major points with Laci. The couple spent a lot of time together, often visiting Scott's parents' house to do laundry and enjoy home-cooked meals. Laci and Scott's mom formed a close bond, sharing a love for gardening and spending time watching Martha Stewart together. Their shared interests helped strengthen their connection. Laci and Scott tied the knot in August 1997, and their families were very close, genuinely enjoying each other's company. It all seemed so happy and perfect. Laci graduated from college in December 1997, and Scott followed with his graduation the next summer, in June 1998. The future looked bright for them, but little did anyone know that things were about to take a dark turn. After Scott graduated, he and Laci began planning their next steps. Scott's parents gave him a share of their business, which he sold to fund the opening of a bar and restaurant. Once they felt ready to settle down, the couple sold the business and relocated to Modesto, California, in June 2000. Scott's parents generously gifted the couple $30,000 for a down payment on a home, which they used to buy a charming house nearby. Laci began working as a substitute teacher, while Scott took on a job as a sales rep for a fertilizer company. With their combined income, they started making upgrades to their new home, excitedly building their life together. They decided to add a built-in pool to their home, a sign of their growing success and enjoyment of their upgraded lifestyle. Scott's dad then gave him another $30,000, this time to join the Del Rio Country Club in Modesto. This exclusive private club required an invitation for membership and was known for its high fees, enjoying financial stability, and feeling ready to take the next step in their lives. They decided it was time to start a family. However, despite trying for about 3 years, they struggled to conceive and faced difficulties in their journey to become parents. They had considered adoption as an option, but then Laci had a delightful surprise. She became pregnant. Both Scott and Laci were thrilled about the news. Throughout her pregnancy, Laci made a concerted effort to stay fit and healthy. She regularly went on walks, attended yoga classes, and tried to maintain a clean diet. However, later in her pregnancy, she began to feel unwell during her walks, even while simply taking her dog out. She shared this concern with family members, noting that she was experiencing nausea during these activities. Laci reported feeling uncontrollably sick and worried she might pass out while walking her dog. After taking a break, she tried walking again, but the same symptoms occurred. Concerned, she consulted her doctor, who advised her to stop walking and focus more on resting to ensure her well-being and the health of her pregnancy. Laci followed her doctor's advice and stopped walking. While it might seem minor, this detail becomes significant later on. By November 2002, Laci decided to quit her job as a substitute teacher due to the increasing difficulties of her pregnancy. She was feeling unwell and extremely uncomfortable, making it clear that she needed to prioritize her health and well-being. Fortunately, Laci was able to quit her job and focus on her health. During this period, Scott bought a 14-foot aluminum boat, a fairly ordinary purchase, but notable because he never mentioned it to anyone. It's unclear whether Laci knew about the boat. However, she was the type of person who would typically share such news with her family, saying something like, "Oh, Scott bought a boat." Laci's father was an avid fisherman, so a boat was something familiar and perhaps even meaningful to her. While Laci focused on managing her pregnancy, Scott seemed to be dealing with it in his own way. He had an acquaintance, a female friend, which is where things start to get a bit unusual. Scott's acquaintance suggested he meet a friend named Amber Fry, believing they would get along well. Despite his reservations, Scott's friend convinced him to go on a date with Amber and even gave him her phone number. It's a move that raises eyebrows, as it reflects poorly on the so-called friend. Definitely a reminder to avoid being that kind of friend who meddles in such personal matters. Scott decides to call Amber using the number he was given and leaves her a voicemail, saying that his friend recommended they connect. Amber returns his call, and during their conversation, Scott describes himself to her. He mentions that he isn't very tall, is overweight with a belly and has long, greasy hair. Scott's self-description to Amber was quite blunt. He mentioned being short, overweight, and having long, greasy hair. It makes one wonder if he was intentionally downplaying his appearance, perhaps hoping she'd decline the date. Given how he resembled Ben Affleck, it seems unlikely he needed to minimize his looks. It raises the possibility that Scott might have been setting the stage for an easier out if things didn't go as planned. They decided to meet at the Elephant Bar in Fresno on November 20th, 2002. After their initial meeting at the bar, they opted to go out for Japanese food. During their time together, Scott mentioned he needed to check into his hotel and invited Amber to join him. Scott booked a hotel room for the occasion, and after arriving, he decided to take a shower and get dressed for dinner while Amber waited in the room. It's an unconventional choice for a first date, inviting someone to your hotel room and then taking a shower. It definitely raises eyebrows and might make one wonder about the intentions behind such an invitation, as it could be interpreted as a more intimate or suggestive gesture. Scott and Amber went up to the hotel room together, where Scott took a shower and got dressed. They then enjoyed some strawberries and champagne before heading out for a meal. During their time together, they discussed Amber's work as a massage therapist. Scott shared that he was single, living in Sacramento, and mentioned that his job involved a warehouse in Modesto. Scott told Amber about his travel plans, mentioning that he would be going to Alaska for Thanksgiving, Maine for the holidays, and then to Paris for New Year's, with plans to travel across Europe in January for business. After their dinner and conversation, they returned to Scott's hotel room, where Amber stayed with him that night. At this point, it's unclear where Laci was or what she was doing. It's likely Scott told Laci he had work commitments or some other excuse to justify his absence. As Thanksgiving approached, Scott and Laci traveled to San Diego to stay with Scott's family. During their trip to San Diego, Scott and Laci decided to visit Disneyland. Unfortunately, Laci was not enjoying the trip. She was feeling very sick and uncomfortable. Pregnancy experiences vary greatly. While some people love every moment of it, others face significant discomfort and challenges. For someone dealing with the discomforts of pregnancy, a trip to Disneyland can be particularly daunting. With all the walking and limited rides to enjoy, it's not exactly the most relaxing outing. After returning home, Scott had arranged a second date with Amber, continuing their connection despite the ongoing challenges at home. Scott and Amber planned to meet on December 2nd for a hike, and Amber was bringing her daughter along since Scott wanted to meet her. After their hike, they returned to Amber's house, where they cooked dinner together. Scott ended up staying the night at Amber's place. It's important to note that many people criticize Amber, but she was unaware of Scott's situation and had no way of knowing what was going on behind the scenes. Scott was turning on the charm with Amber, much like he had with Laci years earlier. Back at home, he told Laci that he was busy with work-related commitments like conferences and meetings. Meanwhile, 3 weeks before Christmas, Laci's grandmother passed away, adding a somber note to the holiday season. Laci's grandmother left behind a substantial inheritance, with the entire estate valued at around $2 million, to be divided among Laci and her 2 siblings once they turned 30. On December 9th, Scott asked Amber if he could visit her because he needed to discuss something important. When he arrived at her house, he sat at the kitchen table and began to cry, leaving Amber concerned and unsure of what was happening. Scott, still crying, confessed to Amber that he hadn't been entirely honest with her. He told her that he had been married before and his wife had recently passed away, making this his first Christmas without her. The truth was far different. His wife was actually at home, pregnant, and alive. This revelation cast a shadow of suspicion over Scott's actions and intentions. Scott told Amber that he didn't want any biological children and that her daughter would be sufficient for him, even mentioning he was open to getting a vasectomy. This gesture might have been intended to impress Amber or reassure her, but she found it a bit extreme. As Christmas approached, the complexities of their situation and Scott's actions continued to unfold. Scott informed Amber that he would be traveling over the next few weeks, but promised to do his best to maintain their relationship despite his absences. On December 15th, Laci's mother, Sharon, visited Scott and Laci's home. Tragically, this would be the last time she would see her daughter. That evening, Scott was supposed to cook lasagna for dinner, but he was running late from work. In reality, he was at Amber's house. As a result, Laci ended up serving a frozen dinner instead. Sharon, Laci's mom, noticed that Laci seemed quite annoyed but didn't express her frustrations openly to her mother. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Scott claimed he woke up around 8 a.m. and found that Laci was already up. According to Scott, Laci was eating a bowl of cereal, as she needed to eat first thing in the morning to avoid feeling sick. Scott initially said he woke up to find Laci already eating cereal alone. However, his story later changed to say that they had eaten cereal together. According to Scott, he asked Laci about her plans for the day. She intended to go for a walk, bake gingerbread cookies, and then head to the store to buy special bread. Before leaving that morning, Scott loaded 3 patio umbrellas into his truck to take to his warehouse. A neighbor observed this and smiled, waving as Scott drove off. Scott then returned briefly to fill a mop bucket for Laci so she could clean while he was out. He told Laci he was going golfing. Scott headed south but soon realized it was too cold for golf. Instead, he decided to go on a fishing trip at the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles from Modesto. Before heading to the marina, Scott stopped by his warehouse to check on the boat and spend some time working on the computer. Scott left the warehouse at 11:18 a.m. and purchased a boating ticket at 12:54 p.m. When later questioned about his fishing trip, Scott couldn't specify what he was fishing for or the type of bait and lures he used. His lack of detailed answers, combined with the fact that it was December and his fishing trip was rather spontaneous, raised further suspicions about the authenticity of his fishing activity. December is generally not an ideal time for fishing, especially in colder climates. Later, Scott claimed that when he got out on the water, he realized he had forgotten his bait. Despite not being able to specify what kind of bait he had, he tried fishing anyway, but eventually decided to head back in. Scott, feeling cold and wet, decided to cut his fishing trip short. Several people reported seeing Laci walking her dog around 10 a.m. that morning near the park. However, later that day, their dog was found running around the block outside their home, still wearing its leash. On his way back, Scott stopped for gas around 3:25 p.m. and returned to his warehouse around 4:15 p.m. When Scott got home, he noticed the dog was in the yard with its leash still on. He removed the leash from the dog, then went inside. Upon entering, he saw that the mop bucket was still out and full. Afterwards, Scott said he went outside to check the mail and noticed Laci's car was still in the driveway, which he found odd. He assumed she must be at her mom's house. Scott then took out some leftover pizza, poured himself a glass of milk, and did a load of laundry. After his shower, Scott got dressed and checked the answering machine. He found a message from Ron, Laci's stepfather, which made him realize something was wrong. At that moment, Scott began to worry. Scott called Sharon, asking if Laci was with her. Sharon said no, and Scott mentioned that Laci's car was still at home and their dog was in the backyard with its leash on, which he found strange. Sharon then suggested that Scott should call Laci's friends. It was at this point that Sharon realized Scott had used the word missing. Laci was missing. Sharon had a sinking feeling something was wrong, so she had Ron call the police. As Ron handled that, Sharon got ready and headed to the dog park to search for Laci, hoping she might have fallen or gotten hurt. She told Scott to meet her there, but he didn't arrive until much later, accompanied by the police. That night, around 70 to 80 people gathered to help search for Laci. Sharon asked Scott about Laci's day, and he said she was supposed to go to the store, walk the dog, and make gingerbread cookies. When Ron asked Scott if he had gone golfing, Scott responded that he hadn't. He had gone fishing instead. Ron, an avid fisherman himself, asked Scott what time he went fishing. Scott replied it was at 9:30 a.m., but Ron quickly pointed out that's also when Scott returned home, casting doubt on his story. The police then began questioning Scott and went inside the home to take photos, starting their investigation. The police found it odd that Scott had done a load of laundry, especially since it was just his own clothes. What made it even stranger was that there was a pile of dirty rags on top of the washer and a full basket of dirty clothes in a hamper in the bedroom. Exactly, it's those little inconsistencies that can raise red flags. It's unusual to do a load of laundry and only wash a small portion of clothes while leaving other items that could have been washed at the same time. The dirty rags and the full laundry basket made the situation even more suspicious to the investigators. Sometimes it's these seemingly trivial details that can be crucial in a larger investigation. That makes sense. When personal items like jewelry and a purse are left behind, especially when someone is known to always wear them, it can be a strong indicator that something might be wrong. These observations, combined with Scott's inconsistencies, led the police to be suspicious, even if they didn't yet have concrete evidence. At this stage, the police were likely beginning to build their case and look for more evidence or witnesses to confirm their suspicions. The inconsistencies and missing details would definitely make the investigation more suspicious. This is only the beginning of a case that gripped the nation and left everyone questioning what they thought they knew. In Part 2, we'll dive deeper into the investigation, uncover shocking revelations, and follow the twists and turns that make this one of the most infamous cases in recent history. The answers might be closer than you think. Don't miss the next part, subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. And if you'd like to support the channel, consider making a donation through PayPal. The link is in the description and comment below. Your support helps us continue to bring you these deep dives into true crime.